a major concern in democratization under the Fourth Republic, that is, since 1999. While privatization and deregulation has increased the number of broadcasting services and improved pluralism and diversity of media, it has done little to bring improvement in professional and ethical conduct in broadcasting or to minimize the influence of vested interests, government and private, on broadcasting. It is also arguable whether access has been widened by as much as is desired by privatization, given the for-profit disposition of the services and their lack of independence from the influence of their owners, who quite often are also partisan in their inclinations. If anything, the unwholesome practices of the Second Republic, which were mentioned earlier with regards to use of incumbency and state control of public broadcasting services, continued with impunity, with private operators joining the fray even more vociferously. The role of the Nigerian broadcasting services, especially during the electionary activities leading to 2011 and 2015 general elections, amply demonstrate this. I know this from the point of view of being at INEC. I know the efforts we made to reach out to broadcasting services, to even do public service in terms of public enlightenment and sensitization with regards to election. And what is clear is that even public broadcasting outfits are driven by the challenges of commercialization. This is important to deepen democracy, to enlighten the public and sensitize them about participation in election. But content or messages cannot be carried until they or unless they are paid for. And it's a very, very serious challenge for public broadcasters not to be central and critical in that role. And of course, we've also seen where with impunity, public broadcasting agencies displayed crass partisanship in terms of the messages and the contents that they carry. With regards to the government-controlled public broadcasters, in most cases, incumbent governments and parties at both the state and federal levels secured undue advantage and unfair and disproportionate coverage of their activities. Not only did they deny fair and equitable coverage to opposition parties and candidates, they denied access to their services to even those willing to pay and place advertisements. They lacked editorial independence and displayed impartiality in coverage and in programming. Some of them actually illegally contravened extant regulations on even declaration of results during elections. The NBC, not for lack of trying, still seemed helpless in checking some of these excesses. With regards to private broadcasting services, their role in the 2011 and 2015 electioneering activities made it evident that the regulation, privatization, and liberalization of broadcasting do not in themselves facilitate democratization. Driven by profit motivation or vested political interests, private broadcasting services either pander to their owners' political and partisan interests or to incumbent governments with patronage to dispense and state power to cower and intimidate. In the 2015 general elections in particular, some private broadcasters undertook partisan programming, the contents of which may have violated regulatory provisions on hate speech and or impartial coverage. And I'm very glad that the Permanent Secretary in her opening remarks actually emphasized that point. So having reviewed this historical origin and the nature and the character of broadcasting in Nigeria, what impact can we say that broadcasting had on Nigeria's democratic development? The contemporary role of broadcasting in Nigeria's democratic development, therefore, leaves much to be desired. We cannot say there is no positive impact, but we must say that the impact has not been substantial, it has not been as it should have been, and therefore it leaves much to be desired. Over time, and especially in the past 2 decades, a lot has been gained in terms of the pluralism and diversity of broadcasting services. Yet, public broadcasting has not become the instrument of democracy that it is expected to be. Internal and especially externally induced constraints, I believe, are responsible for this. For one thing, colonial heritage and post-colonial state policies and dispositions, especially under decades of military rule, posed considerable external constraints, a baggage that public broadcasting agencies have carried with them over time. Due to the history of military rule and other forms of reckless misrule in post-independent Nigeria, there has been, and I think this is a very, very important point, there has been a conflation of government in power and the state's institutions. And there needs to be a separation between government in power and state institutions. State institutions are continuous regardless of government, and they are expected to be impartial and non-partisan and to discharge their responsibilities professionally, competently, and effectively. But historically, unfortunately, and you can say this about many public institutions in Nigeria, but since we are speaking about public broadcasting services, there is a clear conflation between the state in power and the responsibility of the public broadcasting service. Arising from this, or as a result of this, public broadcasting has basically become state or government broadcasting. Hence, national broadcasting has tended to support the ideology or the idiosyncrasies of the government in power, whether at the state or at the federal level. This explains why incumbent governments see no issue in either restricting access to public media for those considered to be in the opposition, or in converting public broadcasting outfits to execute their partisan agendas, or even in harassing journalists and broadcasters who have exhibited a tendency to assert their independence and impartiality in their professional conduct. The privatization of broadcasting has witnessed a proliferation of radio and television stations owned by federal and state governments, as well as private entrepreneurs and even communities. As a result, there is pluralism and diversity in terms of many owners and operators on the scene, and different owners and operations and a range of content. However, these have not been accompanied by structural and behavioral reforms that can ensure real public service by these public agencies. Thank you. It would seem that liberalization and privatization of broadcasting has occurred in Nigeria devoid of an appropriate policy framework backed by a strong and independent regulatory authority. It is now imperative, I believe, to bridge this gap and undertake structural and behavioral reforms which would reposition public broadcasting services to play the role of instruments of democratic development in Nigeria. So how do we reposition broadcasting for democratic development? Broadcasting in Nigeria has its own challenges and internally induced constraints, apart from the external constraints which I have talked about. Understanding these and addressing them is central to repositioning and empowering broadcasting to make positive impact on addressing the challenges of democratization in contemporary Nigeria. Broadcasting in Nigeria is institutionally weak and it lacks democratic content. To play a greater role in national democratic consolidation, broadcasting in Nigeria needs to be significantly democratized and infused with democratic values and ideals. Thus, we need to broaden our conception of broadcasting from mere contribution to state-directed or government-controlled nation-building and socio-economic development to include facilitation, promotion, and protection of democratic development and its consolidation. Public service broadcasting needs to be strengthened to ensure that structural imbalances and lack of access do not undermine democratic development. Broadcasting needs to undergo considerable reform to acquire democratic content for it to play a significant role in democratic consolidation in Nigeria. Democracy, I think this point has been generally recognized, democracy cannot be nurtured with undemocratic institutions and tendencies. In particular, the government-controlled broadcasters must be transformed in all senses into public service broadcasters and strong institutions relatively independent of government. This is very important for them to play the critical role that is expected of them in our democratization process and in Nigeria's democratic development. But for this to happen, there has to be a clearly articulated media and broadcasting policy backed by an excellent regulatory framework to both protect the autonomy of the broadcasting institutions and agencies and to ensure that they do not sacrifice the public good on the altar of vested political interests or profit motives. In addition, attention has to be paid to the following: adequate funding, very, very important and crucial. Virtually all public institutions are weak, and at the bottom or source of that weakness has to be with underfunding. Not to talk, of course, about corruption, where the little that comes in is also siphoned away. So attention has to be paid to funding. It also has to be paid, and most importantly, to institutional independence. That's very, very important. Then professionalization of staff, and I think somebody has mentioned that. We are digitalizing, people need to be trained, but beyond that, people also need to know that as professionals, they have obligations and responsibilities to demonstrate not just efficiency and effectiveness, but also impartiality and non-partisanship in the discharge of their responsibilities. But there also needs to be motivation and security of tenure for staff. There must also be a strong code of ethical conduct and a robust legal and regulatory framework. And I think at the bottom of it, as I have said earlier on, even in my role in INEC, I have related with MBC, and I can see sometimes there is the will or the intention to do good, but there are constraints which are not unrelated with the overbearing influence of the government in power. And it is very, very important, therefore, that there are very good, strong legal framework that can strengthen the institutional capacities of a regulatory agency such as the MBC for it to be able to discharge its role efficiently. I have said that even the laws establishing the MBC were actually laws created under military rule. And it is important that we recognize that a review of some of these laws is important because it can bring the important things that are required in terms of relative autonomy and also professional conduct. So in conclusion, I would like to say that from the foregoing, it can be surmised that beyond the 2015 general elections, it is the aspiration of most Nigerians that through a good democratic governance framework, Nigeria turns a new leaf and reinvents itself into a new Nigeria. A new Nigeria freed of recklessness and squandermania of the past, with a focus and discipline to diversify the economy, harness available resources, and address the needs of the citizens. The framework for this, I believe, is deepened and consolidated democracy, in which free and fair elections are regular, and in which votes count, and elected executives and representatives are held to account, and they also, knowing that they are held to account, they speedily respond to the objective needs and aspirations of the citizens. Public broadcasting, if repositioned, and it must be repositioned, has a great positive role to play towards our aspiration for democratic development. In this regard, and I'm now going to be very specific, the Buhari government has a responsibility, indeed an obligation, under the mantra of change for a new Nigeria, to contribute to the reform and the repositioning of broadcasting so that it can play a remarkably improved role in Nigeria's democratic development. Before coming into power at the federal level, the party now in power has been a victim of incumbent government's influence and control of broadcasting, which made the 2011 and 2015 electioneering campaigns gargantuan David versus Goliath affairs. So now in power, it has a rare opportunity to make things right and create a better level playing field for the future. It has a responsibility to turn broadcasting services from merely government broadcasters to truly public broadcasting services, and to turn the regulatory agencies, especially the MBC, into a remarkably independent, consensuous, and non-partisan regulator, both by law and in practice. As we make broadcasting plural and diverse under the regulation, there is also the urgent task to make the philosophy and values of public broadcasting deeply ingrained in our political economy. It is necessary to insulate public broadcasting services from commercial or private and governmental influences. It is important that they are repositioned to be impartial, to be non-partisan, and to be independent. We must have a strong legal regulatory framework and an effective regulatory agency that can discharge its responsibilities transparently and with integrity. I believe that among all the major expectations of Nigerians on the Buhari government, this is a major expectation. Make public broadcasting to truly serve the public, not the vested interests of politicians or those in power. That is the only way to deepen democracy and to turn a new leaf in Nigeria and to begin to build the Nigeria that we desire. Thank you very much.
The enigmatic and quintessential Jega himself. He has called for a public service broadcasting. And while before he did that, he went memory lane, bent over backwards, told us that the military was characterized by squandermania and created the laws that established the MBC, and that there is a need for a retooling of the over 450 broadcast stations and radio stations we have, so that they can become effective public service broadcast outfits. He says the public media is being seized by private persons and diverted from public good, such that they have been playing the role very, very epileptically and resulting in serious turns and twists. I think that the NBC has gotten a run for their money because Jega will say it exactly the way it is. The theme has been broadcasting democracy and the challenge of the new Nigeria. It has been a live broadcast from Abuja, the nation's capital, the NBC's second annual lecture, and we have been having a swell time here listening to Jega as he did his theme. We're still watching.
He represents tens of thousands of professionals that are providing support and professional service to broadcasting. That's the national chairman of Ratau.
Your Excellencies, I was wondering why I should be invited to speak again after a world-acclaimed professor of political science, the most celebrated INEC chairman, and a stubborn bloc in the path of military dictatorship in Nigeria has spoken. But I took solace in what NBC told me. They said I should look at the back of today's program. And when I check it, NBC says the license. And therefore they gave me the license to come here and say one or two things in 2 minutes. Simply, NBC says they, because they say we license, we monitor. The only thing I want to put there is that NBC should also try to see to the welfare of workers in the broadcast industry. There is nothing else that I can say than what our Oga in the trade unionism, a former president of ASU, has said here today. Thank you and God bless you.
Well, so far it's been a wonderful time out here at the second annual lecture of the NBC on the theme Broadcasting Democracy and the Challenge of New Nigeria. Professor Jega has made our day, and we also enjoyed it while it lasted. It is on this note that we want to round off this live broadcast coming from Abuja and on the largest television network, the NTA. Thanks for being part of it. We'll now return to our normal programming. Thank you.
Remain on this short country.